He's a long-term member of the Information Security Registered Assessors Program, so IRAP, and trainer. In addition to IRAP, Dave is Certified Information Systems Auditor and ISO 27001 Senior Lead Auditor. Dave has worked with European, United States, UK and Australian government representatives. So I'm going to ask everyone to welcome Dave to the stage.
Yep. Hear me now? If I keep looking this way, that'll be the reason. Good morning, everyone. So all I get from that is that I'm getting old, and but my main purpose today was just to basically share with you some of my experiences, and I guess discuss some of the issues that I've seen over the years in terms of resilient systems and information security. And basically, I don't want to go too far down the audit route because that's not necessarily the most exciting area, but certainly share with you some of those experiences and see if collectively we can kind of raise the level of information security that we see in the industry. Now, I don't have an opportunity to change slides, so I'm going to have to yell out, not yet, but I'll if you hear me ask the slide to be changed, that's why. So again, showing my age here, Spy versus Spy. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but old comic book set in the Cold War, and essentially you've got the white and the black spy who are constantly racing against each other to outwit, outplay, outfox each other. And it comes to mind a lot for me when I'm looking at systems, because whilst there's a tendency to focus on, particularly for audit, like compliance and checklists and all of that sort of boring stuff, the reality is we live in a world where it is a multitude of different actors with all different reasons for why they are doing what they're doing, primarily financial, but not always. And then a variety of systems that different people rely on, be it satellite systems, power stations, right through to our banking apps. And essentially a battle between these different entities to provide services, to keep the financial systems going, to make money. Let's be honest, that's what a lot of this is about, versus those who are either seeking to undermine democratic governments, push their own influence strategies, and they're happy to talk disinformation and influence at some point if you'd like, although that's not the key part of this presentation. And I think it's something to really keep in mind, particularly if you're developing systems, that this is not just a simple, let's push this app or push this program out without thinking about security, because the reality is that there are malicious actors out there who are targeting these systems. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about today. So when we talk about security, we've got confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And it's a pretty simple concept, but it's really important because it's often forgotten, that you don't necessarily have to have all three at the same time. And sometimes prioritizing what you're going to focus on is a really good way of getting the ability to prioritize how you're going to push an app, what security features you're going to focus on. So for example, if we're talking about your banking app, if you think about confidentiality, integrity, and availability, they're probably all important to different degrees, but you're more likely to find people, for example, are going to want a secure system that gives them the right amount of money in their banking app, as opposed to it being available all the time. Now, that's a tough one, because obviously when you do want to do a transaction, you want it to work. So that's why banks invest quite heavily in cybersecurity as a general rule. You've got other things such as weather satellites, though. So a weather satellite may not be concerned about confidentiality. It might not care who can read the data that it's sending, but it might be very important that the integrity is correct, that the data it sends is accurate. And the reason I raise this is often you have to make some hard choices with security about where you invest your time and your money to secure systems. So the first place to start I would recommend is always thinking about the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the system and which of them are more important. Like I say, sometimes it's all important, but that usually means you need to invest more and focus more on security as opposed to a system that might be really focused on just one or two. Next slide. So we start with something really simple, just confidentiality, integrity, availability, and then it quickly, rapidly grows. So for example, if we look at CISP, the Certified Information Systems Security Practitioner course and exam that ISC Squared runs, we're actually looking there at a variety of different ways of looking at security, be it identity, how do we associate a person with an online presence and what they're doing, right through to, for example, security operations, where we have security operations centers and teams that are specifically focused on detecting, monitoring systems, detecting adversaries, and then pushing them back out of the system. So there's a variety of different areas, and this is one of the issues with cybersecurity when we talk about it, is that it's actually a really big subject. And when someone says to me that they want to get into cybersecurity or they're interested in getting a job in cybersecurity, you rapidly have to start asking questions about, well, specifically, what do you want to do? Because it's a huge area. Next one. And it's not going particularly well, in my opinion. If we look at breaches alone, and I'm sure lots of people in this room would have been caught up in recent Australian breaches. So there's a couple of different sites you can go to that basically provide you with a whole heap of information about recent breaches. But we're talking hundreds of millions of people's information that's out there. And once it's out there, it's pretty much gone. It's lost. And once we get further into things like biometrics and a variety of different solutions that link your physical and things that you can't change about yourself to identity, once those are lost, we're going to be really in trouble because that's not something you can change. It's hard to change what your eye looks like once your biometrics are out there. So these are actually quite serious problems as we go forward. I'm a big fan of moving away from passwords, but I do have the concern that depending on what solutions we come up with, the more breaches that we keep happening, we need the ability to kind of manage the information that's being lost. And I think that's another thing that I'd like to talk about this morning is the philosophy of assumed breach. So particularly if you're developing systems or you're managing networks, the thought that at some point a threat actor is likely to penetrate your defenses and get onto the network, and then building a network and security around that premise and that idea is, I think, something that's missing across a lot of the industry. It's talked about a lot, but there's lots of places you go to, and the reality is once you pass their firewall, you own the network in many cases. So really something to consider when you're developing these systems, and something I'll come back to as we're talking. Yep, next slide. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of depth. I've got a few different examples to talk about just to paint the picture here. So SolarWinds is one attack that, can anyone put up their hands who's heard of SolarWinds and the hack? Yeah, okay. So I won't go into too much detail, but essentially these are what they call supply chain attacks. So the philosophy, if you think about it, and it's really good to think about it from the threat actor or the attacker's perspective, right? So if you think about it from the threat actor, if I'm going to invest a huge amount of time getting into a big company's networks and compromising them, who should I target? I could target like a big bank or someone like that and make as much money as I can, but they're pretty hardened systems. A better option might be to attack a managed service provider or a software provider, get into their networks, and then actually start using them to propagate my malware and to propagate my access. And that's what happened with SolarWinds. Essentially, you get into a software provider's systems and allow them to push your access across a whole heap of other organizations and companies. And then once you've got that access, you can cherry pick who's most valuable to you and who you want to retain access for. So that's what SolarWinds was, and it's an example of what we're seeing more and more. Managed service providers and even security firms that have lots of different customers are a great target, because once you've got access, you can then pivot across a lot of different other organizations and kind of pick who you're going to focus on and where you're going to get the best benefit depending on what your motivations are. Next slide. So GoDaddy is another example of that. And I guess like these are big organizations that have a real incentive to have good security. But if you look at it, like 2020, 2021, 2022, every year, and these are the things that they can then go back and detect. You've got compromised systems, you've got lateral movement, and you've got potentially malware being inserted onto other people's servers or other people's information being accessed. Next slide. And then LastPass. Have we got any LastPass users in the room? Yeah, me too. So LastPass, classic breach, where it turns out once you actually get into the details, like all the URLs that are stored on LastPass that were linked to a password weren't even encrypted. So when that information was extracted, not only do they get the encrypted passwords, but they also get access to all of the services that you were using. That's really valuable information, and something that isn't talked about too much, but occasionally comes up, is the fact that all of these different breaches, if you put them together, you can build amazing pictures of people, what they do, where they go, what services they use, and really, if you want to target people specifically, and they're generally going to be high value targets that you put this kind of effort into, but you can build an amazing picture about someone once you know everything from what password sites they're going through, right through to who they bank with, what their date of birth is. You put it all together, you get a pretty good picture. And that is a concern, particularly, as I say, if you're a kind of a high value target. And it's possible that one day, either now or in the future, you could be. It's not always necessarily about the fact that you're famous or you have lots of money. It could also be that you are working on a system that has either national security implications or give someone access to something, and it's quite possible that at some point in the future you could be targeted based on some of this information that's out there. Next slide. So depending on, and I'm aware there's a broad range of people involved this morning, so I'm going to kind of jump around so that I can cover a wide variety of different technical and non-technical areas. So the first point is kind of the common vulnerabilities and exposures, and the idea that when you build software, at a certain point, it's almost inevitable there's going to be vulnerabilities in that software. And there's lots of things you can do to try to mitigate that and prevent it, but the reality is at some point there will be vulnerabilities, if not now, in the future. And some of that might even just be based on the dependency packages and systems that you're using to support your software. So we have things like the common vulnerabilities and exposures records. You'll see there 196,000 records at the moment, and I would argue that's probably a tiny percentage of the reality of what's out there. These are just the registered ones. Next slide. Then we have a subset of that, which is the known exploited vulnerability. So it's one thing to have a vulnerability, it's another thing for there to actually be an exploit out there that someone has used in the past or developed. And these are where you're going to look at trying to basically patch. You're going to try to prevent an adversary from being able to use these exploits. This is on the more technical end in terms of developers and potentially running networks where you're pushing patches regularly throughout a network. The reality is at an enterprise level, patching is harder than it sounds. And next slide. And this is not the best picture, but it gives you an idea. This is from CISA, which is one of the US cybersecurity government organizations. This is kind of their advice on how to manage patching and vulnerabilities. And you can see, like, this is just a little snapshot of reality. If you're trying to run a big enterprise network and you're trying to manage all the vulnerabilities across that with all the different applications and systems, plus then identify what's the priority for patching, it actually gets quite complicated. And pushing a patch on legacy older networks is also very difficult at times because you can bring the whole network down, you can break lots of things. So as a result, patching, whilst it sounds really simple, is not necessarily as simple as that. It does depend on how well you set up. If you're in cloud and you've got all the latest things, it's a lot easier. But the reality is lots of different places, particularly around Canberra, are running legacy systems that this can be quite a difficult task. Next slide. So there's that side. There's the kind of vulnerability hacker view. And then there's the simpler reality of how a lot of this stuff happens. And that is, for example, dumb password rules. If you are using a system or a site that doesn't even give you the option of more than 8 characters and it can't be complex, you're kind of in trouble to begin with. And there's actually, I quite like this site. It's a site that basically names and shames a whole heap of different services and companies out there that prevent you from using good passwords. And I certainly don't want to focus on passwords today, but it is like, if you think about it again, if you're a threat actor, why would you go for somewhere that's got all the walls up and is super secure if there's somewhere else you can go where they're really not even bothering with security? It's kind of the analogy of the lion and the gazelle. The slowest gazelle is the one that's going to get eaten. It's a similar thing in cybersecurity. Next slide. And this is an example. So this is a couple of years old now, but this is CISA did an analysis of 112 assessments that they'd done on places that had been compromised, and these were fairly large, generally government organizations. And of those, the initial access, a large proportion was either phishing or it was valid accounts. So we're not talking super sophisticated Mr. Robot kind of hacks here. What we're talking about are credentials that have been exposed through other breaches and/or someone clicking on a link that's come through on an email or opening an attachment on an email that was from a malicious actor. Most of this is pretty simple stuff, to be honest. Next slide. Another one that it's not too sexy, so it doesn't get too much airplay, but is very common, is business email compromise. So this is essentially, and everyone in here would have had a whole heap of messages on their phone or alternatively through their email, which is indicative of this kind of attack. It doesn't even need to have a link or an attachment initially. It might be just a straight up email to get you to respond. And then once you've built up a little bit of rapport and trust, then comes the ask, be it to transfer money to an account or to go to a particular site. This happens a lot more than you would like, particularly in big organizations, ones that haven't got really good processes to manage it, where financial systems, someone will be targeted in procurement, for example, and they'll end up transferring money to a different account and end up losing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars. It does happen. There's a few different ways you can manage this. One is by process. So for example, if you get a request to change bank account details, that there's an extra step involved that tries to confirm that's actually the person. And also training, to be honest. A lot of places don't provide training for high-risk users, such as procurement people, and that's a really simple way of managing a lot of this risk. Next slide. So, from my perspective, this from the threat actor's view, it's working. So you look at the this is crypto trends by Chain Analysis, which is one of the crypto tracking organizations. And the value of ransomware addresses has increased significantly over the last few years. Now, crypto is just one method of payment, but I guess the trend is pretty obvious that lots of places are getting hacked, whether they admit it or not. And in many cases, no one knows because they're making the payment and then the information just disappears. And customers have no idea. In many cases, governments don't know. It's all being done kind of in the back doors. Next slide. And as a result, it's getting a lot more expensive for firms to do this because threat actors know they're onto a good thing. And we'll talk about in a moment some of the legislation that's been discussed, particularly for breaches and reporting, so reporting of data breaches. But the reality is no matter, whilst this is still going on, the fact is this is really good money for threat actors, and therefore they have the incentive to keep going. Next slide. So it's a changing landscape as well, in terms of if you're trying to track from a cyber threat intelligence perspective, the malicious actors and what they do. Telegram is an example. So massive increase, particularly of Russian users of Telegram. And there's a couple of different aspects to that. One is there's a really good Wired article that I'd recommend having a look at that talks about Telegram from the Russian intelligence perspective and the fact that it's one of the apps and systems that they have pretty good a view of and are able to track pretty well. So therefore, there's more of an incentive to use it in the fact that you're less likely to have it blocked and have the service attacked. But the other part is that there's quite a big community on there in terms of initial access. So there's a whole ecosystem in terms of the hacking community. So for example, I might be an expert at initial access. So I'll focus on being able to get that initial compromise of a system into an organization. I'll then go onto a forum, for example, somewhere like Telegram, and I'll sell that access to somebody else who then specializes in actually getting onto that system and compromising it at a bigger picture and doing lateral movement. So there's a whole ecosystem. So the ability to communicate, to meet like-minded hackers is something that a lot of people look for, and this is one example of that kind of environment. Next slide. So I'm not going to give you a lecture on this, but essentially there's the view that we've got the open web, which is things like Facebook, Twitter, etc. Then below that, the deep web. So a lot of different systems that both government and organizations run. And then finally at the bottom, the darknet. And it's really interesting in terms of the view that you can have about darknet. A lot of it is illicit activity. It's things like carding, forums, etc. But there's also a heap of other sites on there for people that are trying to either remain anonymous, or alternatively, you've got some random sites that different both organizations and people will run on various topics. So it's not all bad, but there's actually been, next slide. There's actually been an interesting trend with darknet, and it relates to my prior discussion about, for example, Telegram, where what we're seeing is I guess, a slow death of that forum in terms of a lot of, there's always been a lot of dead links on Darknet, but a significant increase. And Recorded Future's done an interesting report looking at the number of dead links that are now on Darknet. And this part of the slide depicts kind of on the left-hand side, a really rich integrated environment of lots of different people connecting. And the one on the right shows a very, very small, like point-to-point connections, not very rich. That's kind of indicative of the real criminal gangs, the one on the right. So if you go to some of the darknet sites, there are still some quite active forums, but the reality is that most of the ones that are really deep into the proper illicit activity, particularly the fraud and financial crime sort of areas, are actually very much known actors interacting with each other and not a big community at all. Which is why, as I said before, in terms of things like Telegram, you'll get a lot more users, a lot more connections at the moment, because that seems to be one of the preferred sites. So I guess my point here is that it's an evolving landscape all the time. And it actually makes it really interesting, because it means that you're not going to become necessarily a darknet expert and in 20 years' time still be doing that. It's the kind of thing where you need to keep up with what the threat actors are doing and evolve with them. Next slide. So the topic this morning was about resilience, and I briefly wanted to kind of focus on that. The idea of resilience is that you can both anticipate and then respond to and evolve over time the threat. And the reason I picked that as the topic, and rather than just talking about broad cybersecurity, is I think that that's what we're kind of missing the point on with a lot of what we do at the moment in technology. Where where I started in terms of confidentiality, integrity, availability, that's really important. But it's also about having a dynamic system that can adjust to a moving target and a moving environment. And we do that commercially quite well. Like, a lot of different systems will evolve over time because they've got to keep up with their competitors. And I would argue it's the same thing when we're building resilient cybersecurity systems and information security systems. We need to keep up with the adversary. We need to keep up with the threat. So a key part of this is understanding what your mission or business objectives are. And that comes back to not just what are we in this for and what's our business, but also understanding from the perspective of the threat actor, what are they likely to target in your business? What are they likely to do that's going to affect your mission or your business objectives? Yep. So this is really where we're looking at, again, the next kind of layer of those steps, where we want to be able to maintain the system. We want to be able to continue essential business functions. We want to be able to restore, and then we want to be able to adapt. And I think adapt is the one I would stress on in terms of being able to look at, particularly when you see what's happening across the ecosystem with different organizations being hacked, understanding what's happened to them before it happens to you and adjusting. This doesn't necessarily have to be about after you've been compromised. It's about understanding who's coming for you. Next slide. So this is an issue from a government perspective as well. There's the ANAO audit. So PSPF Policy 10 relates to the Essential 8, for those who understand the Essential 8. And when this was written, it was actually the top 4. And what we've got is a significant proportion of these systems are not well secured. They don't have a lot of the most basic security principles built into them. Some of that's because of sometimes their age or the functions that they're performing. But the fact is that there's a lot of these systems are behind the times in terms of their security. And that's something that I'm hoping over time that we can all kind of help fix and lift. And if you're working in the government sector, again, understanding that the importance of security and the importance of protecting this information, and then actually following through with the investment in the systems. A lot of people in government are very aware of the information that they hold, and they're actually do a lot of good things to secure those systems, but generally it's the investment side and upgrading those systems that kind of lags. And this is one of the reasons, complexity. It's not too hard if you've got a network of 10 machines to keep that secure and running. It gets increasingly complex as you're providing more and more services and have more and more customers. And this is an example of the Microsoft cybersecurity reference architecture. And to be honest, unless you go completely cloud native and you've got everything running the very latest, this is actually a tough job, because once you get into hybrid environments or you're running your own infrastructure, cybersecurity is actually quite a difficult task. Next slide. And this is an example of that. So the average CISO, so Chief Information Security Officer, which is kind of usually the senior information security person in the organization, the average duration of their job is 17 months, which the reason I have that hamster on there is there's a CISO that I know in the US who equates this to the lifespan of a hamster. So the average lifespan of a CISO is about the same as the lifespan of a hamster, which I thought is a great analogy. And less than half last 5 years. So that's a combination of stress, but also if you get breached, the CISO is generally the person that is hung out to dry. And the reality is that you're either breached or you're not. And if you're not, you might be you just don't know it. So there's a whole heap of CISOs over the last few years who have basically lost their jobs because they've been breached. In some cases, depending on the organization and how it happened, you could argue there was nothing they could have done about it. In other cases, perhaps they could have. But it's certainly it's a pretty serious one if that's your job. So in terms of governance principles, the AICD, so company directors, they've released some really interesting information in terms of like questions to ask boards, and basically try an attempt to get leadership to focus on cybersecurity. But in many cases, that's still something that hasn't quite happened properly yet, in that the financial incentives aren't quite there yet to drive a lot of boards to focus on cybersecurity. And to be fair, if you're on a board or you're in a senior executive position, you've got a lot of different things to deal with. And cyber is often kind of right down the bottom of the list. So a lot of companies and organizations, if you look at their risk registers, there'll be 1 or 2 risks that relate to cyber out of a whole register. And in many cases, that's fair, because it might be that they have a whole heap of other financial and commercial and legal things that they're concerned about. So it's something when you work in the cybersecurity industry or you work in IT, it's kind of up there as an important thing, but that's not necessarily the case if you're trying to run a really big business or organization. Next slide. So when we talk about threat actors, there's 3 components: capability, intent, and opportunity. And the capability and intent is something that, unless you're kind of talking government level, you can't necessarily do much about. But the opportunity part is definitely an area where if you're running an IT shop or a cybersecurity organization, you can impact what opportunity a threat actor has in relation to you by basically defending your infrastructure and defending your data. So this is where the kind of big impact from a cybersecurity perspective comes. What are your vulnerabilities and how do you mitigate those? Next slide. So one of the models that's used a lot in the industry is the pyramid of pain. So the pyramid of pain is basically an indication of how painful it is for a threat actor or an adversary to change this information when you are trying to detect them. So as an example, down the bottom, hash values, pretty easy to change. IP addresses, again, pretty easy to change. But at the top level, your tools and your tactics, techniques, and procedures are a lot more painful as a threat actor to change. And therefore, as a defender, what we want to do is focus up here. If we can identify a threat actor's tactics, techniques, and procedures, if we can identify a threat actor's tools, we've got a much better chance of being able to detect them over a long period. If we focus on things like hash values and IP addresses, that's something that they can change very quickly, and therefore our information becomes out of date very fast. So this is one of the models kind of used extensively when we're talking about threat actors and defending against them. Now, I should note though, if you're talking about a security operations center, these sorts of things are still very valuable. So if you can block known IP addresses that are malicious and you can identify hash values of malware, that's valuable. It's just that you have to do that with the knowledge that the threat actor is going to keep changing them. Next slide. And there's some really good knowledge bases out there that try to lift the conversation up to the tactics, techniques, and procedures. So the MITRE attack matrix, for example, is a fantastic tool that I would recommend having a look at. So it runs all the way from reconnaissance through to impact and exfiltration, and tries to model what a threat actor is likely to do in terms of maneuvering across the system, attacking a system, and then doing lateral movement, etc. Next slide. Another good resource that I'd recommend is the Diamond model of intrusion analysis. So this again really reinforces that link between the victim and adversary, but it's generally through infrastructure. And it's both understanding the adversary's infrastructure and also your own and how they connect. So again, a reference I would recommend having a look at. Next slide. And the whole reason we do this, the cool stuff is the hacking. I would never disagree with that. But the blue team and trying to defend the network is where it's at in terms of actually value adding to society. But also, it's actually really interesting and difficult because if you think about it as a cat and mouse game, you can have a lot of fun in this area. So MITRE defend links to MITRE attack. And what it tries to do is say, well, for each of those attack techniques, this is the tactics, techniques, and procedures for a defender to defend their network against those attacks. So again, it's something I would recommend. Next slide. So we're talking about kind of a moving target environment, which is one of the things the reason I brought up Darknet and Telegram and a whole heap of different views of how the threat actors work is because it's a changing environment. And it's not easy on the other side either. They've had everything from COVID through to a whole heap of different leaks, like the Conti leaks. Things like cloud have changed the dynamics of the target and who they're coming from. And it's all changed the different behaviors that you'll see amongst threat actors. So as a result, I talked earlier about managed service providers are a big target. We're also seeing industrial processes and supply chains now increasingly being targeted for attack, often because they're legacy older systems and they're hard to defend. Insurance companies are a big part of this, because they actually drive a lot of these behaviors, and the insurance companies are becoming aware of that. And as a result, insurance policies are changing over time and what they'll insure from a cyber perspective. But up to date, if you were hacked, in a lot of cases, if you had a good insurance policy, You just got the money paid the ransomware and moved on. That's becoming more difficult. And as a result, there'll be a bigger push for good cybersecurity practices, I think, over time as it becomes more expensive for companies. Yeah, next slide. So there's a lot of changes occurring in government, and a lot of that is about addressing this issue of, for example, paying ransom payments. Alternatively, if we look at the Security Critical Infrastructure Act, you've got scenarios where organisations aren't investing in cybersecurity, but they're providing critical services to the Australian public and to government. So as a result, there's legislation being brought in to regulate that. Now, regulation's a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it will force a baseline and it will force change. On the other hand, it also brings a lot of compliance kind of thinking with it. And as someone who does audits, it's you can tell when you're in an organization that values security versus one that just does what it has to do to kind of tick the box and make sure it's compliant. And I guess that's the issue with regulation. It brings it up to executive and board level attention. It makes them do things, but on the other hand, in some cases, they'll still only do the basics. And that will lift the security posture of Australia and our systems. But what we really want is people there where it's actually valued, the security, and there's a culture of it. Next slide. So again, I'm aware there's a kind of broad audience here, so I just thought I'd touch on a couple other models just for your reference. So the first is the NIST cybersecurity framework. This is a really good model, really detailed model. It's American, so in some cases you'll find organisations in Australia won't use it, but if you're talking multinationals, it's quite extensively used, and is a really good model that I'd recommend you have a look at. Next slide. And you can do some nifty things with this model. So, for example, you can build a matrix, the cybersecurity matrix that looks across each of these areas: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, and then break it down across your different applications and systems and see how you're applying controls against each of those areas, which is a pretty good way on like a one page to map your security posture. Next slide. And that then also allows you to look at what they call left of boom and right of boom. Very American, I know, but it's actually a pretty good way of looking at it. So this is the things that you do prior to an incident, and these are the things that you do post an incident. And basically what we're looking at is how do you identify and protect against adversaries? And then after an event has occurred, after you've been attacked or breached, these are the things that you would do post to recover and restore your system. And again, this comes back to resilience. So we're not just focused on how we protect, also how we respond, and vice versa. Next slide. Last couple of slides. So these are a whole heap of different standards and frameworks that you'll encounter through your career. Even if you're not in cybersecurity and information technology, you'll encounter a whole heap of these. Some of these are very Australian, so the ACS ISM, the Essential 8, for example, and others are more like American chartered accountant models like these, the SOC 2. There's a whole heap of different standards that you'll encounter. And that, to be honest, is one of the most difficult areas in this game, is all the different standards, all the different views they have, and the different ways they look at the problem. Next slide. And there's a really good little cartoon here that basically says, we've got 14 standards, that's ridiculous, let's make one that'll fix them all. And now we have 15 standards. And that's pretty much what's happening. Every time someone comes up with a new good idea, we end up with a new standard. So I thought I'd just finish with a quick discussion about the future threat. So this is from ANISA, the European Union Agency of Cybersecurity, and they looked at a whole heap of different potential future risks for cybersecurity. And it ranged from everything that we're already seeing in terms of, for example, the supply chain compromise like SolarWinds, right through to artificial intelligence abuse. One of the things that isn't in there, interestingly, is quantum. And I think that's because their view was that it's not a risk for 2030, but that's debatable. It depends, I guess, on what information you're storing and what you're looking at. Next slide. So if you do want to have a look at quantum, NIST has a really good discussion about post-quantum cryptography and the 4 quantum-resistant algorithms that they selected, one of which I think was broken within a few days of having been selected. But the point is that this is what's coming. This is the future, and something that's worth at least keeping an eye on. So if you're looking at getting into cybersecurity, another good model from CISA is the NICE or NICE framework, depending on how you want to pronounce it, and a variety of different positions and views of how the different roles that are involved in cybersecurity. Any questions? Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Dave. So I get out of the main thing. For me, resilience is really interesting because, as you say, it's not just about being prepared, but it's how you react afterwards so that it's a reiterative type of thing, isn't it? So when we come to infrastructure, critical infrastructure and the like, making sure that we can keep the lights on, literally. So we have lots of questions. So I'll go to the room first, and then I know that there's a whole lot of questions online that I saw coming through.
Thank you for the presentation.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about what you think is the cause of the decrease or death in nodes in the darknet.
It's a good question. I think there's a variety of factors, but one is trust. And this comes back to, again, if you think about this as a multi-sided game, people only try, like if you're picking a bank, the banking app that you use, you may not have even thought about it, but some banking apps are more secure and trustworthy than others. For some people, that will help inform the decision they make. I would argue that people on darknet are particularly conscious of security, and the fact that there's been a slow sort of erosion in terms of how secure you might consider the darknet in terms of the nodes that run on it, who's monitoring that. Also, I think in terms of just ease of access, it's like most communities online. If you're in a community that's has less and less people involved and is kind of difficult to get access to, you're less likely to use it. So things like Telegram, for example, and other like chat and mobile apps are going to be a lot easier to use than rolling up a machine to log into darknet regularly. So I think that's part of it. There's also other technologies that are anonymized that have kind of emerged that are considered also darknet technologies that might have overtaken it. But again, I think it depends what kind of specific group you're looking at. But yeah, there's always been a lot of dead links on it. I think it's more about ease of access with other tools.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. Okay, thanks for your presentation, David. You touched on crypto ransomware and how that's affecting a lot of companies and how insurance is starting to respond to that. You also linked that to some of the current legislation discussions around policy. How, with business, a lot of it just comes down to money at the end of the day, right?
Totally.
So for a lot of businesses, it's only really worth it to them if that's not going to cost them a lot. What do you think it's going to take for people to stop just paying ransomware to make things go away? And do you think we actually need to make that illegal, which I think is a current point of discussion?
Yeah, so look, it's a really complicated space. And the short answer, personal opinion, I don't think making it illegal is necessarily useful, because there are times where a ransomware payment might be viable. And an example would be, and again, it depends on a lot of different circumstances, but let's say it's highly inflammatory personal data related to individuals' information, and it's known that this particular threat actor is very professional, that they in some cases, some of these threat actors even will allow you to do a forensic analysis to confirm that they haven't copied the data or put it somewhere else. So there are some cases where threat actors who are highly professional will be able to say to you with 99% certainty, this hasn't gone anywhere else, no one's looked at the data, you give us the money, you can have it back. And if it's stuff that's really going to cause some real harm to people, I'm torn, to be honest, as to whether or not then you should pay. Because on the other hand, you're also funding crime. In some cases, these are sanctioned countries or sanctioned organizations. So there's a whole heap of things you need to consider. But I think just making it flat out illegal is, like most things in life, not always the 100% answer. Having said that, we've got to do something. So it's a viable option. But overall, I think it's about making it more painful to get hacked and to lose the data. That's where we should be focusing, rather than worrying. It's like the medical thing of, a symptom versus a cause. Let's treat the cause rather than the symptom. The ransomware really is a symptom. So I would be attacking, like lifting the security posture. The reality is there's always going to be a criminal ecosystem. There's always going to be this stuff going on. So it's about managing it.
So we have one more question in the room before we go to the virtual room.
Thank you. Mentioned about personal information and about those companies that were compromised last year. And I remember specifically with Medibank case, there were reports of users who hadn't been members for a long time, or even not even members at all, that had their information stolen. So my question to you is, what's your opinion on data retention? Should there be limits opposed to that?
Yeah, so good question. So in the information security manual, as well as a number of other models that are out there, there's the idea that you should have a policy on data retention, and that each organization should have a really clear idea of not only what data they're holding, what data they need to hold, and then at what point they delete data or hold on to it, and who can authorize all of that. So I think this comes back to, it's pretty simple stuff when you really get down to it. Like, what data are you collecting? What do you need to keep? What don't you need to keep? And I find it amusing that in a weird way, there's kind of two extremes here. You've got some organizations will keep everything, and then others, because there's a cost to storage, will just expunge everything, and they don't keep anything. And then that has its own problems, because when they get breached or hacked, when you're trying to do incident response and they've got no logs, it's really difficult to do that, because you don't know what's happened. So there's kind of two extremes there, and I think what you want is something that's balanced in the middle, where someone's actually sat down and said, okay, we need to keep, for example, logs for our security systems for a period of time, be it 18 months, 2 years, 7 years, depending. And then customer data, well, certain groups of customers we don't need to have anymore. There's always going to be a degree, if you're going to keep to all the legislation and requirements that are involved in various areas, where you have to keep some data. And a classic example is the old kind of way with security, where if someone left the organization, you delete their account. Causes a whole heap of issues, again, if you're looking later on at trying to understand who's done what with accounts, because you've deleted it. You don't have that identity anymore. So in some cases, you need to keep some information, but again, it's about understanding what that is and then actually documenting and managing it. Does that answer your question? Yeah, I think it's about having a decent policy and really thinking about it. Well, the issue is it depends. So, for example, if you're doing, let's say you're doing fundraising or some sort of financial thing where people are sending money to you, you have to keep a record at some level of who sent you money, because you need to be able to prove, for example, that it wasn't like a criminal transaction. Then there's other cases where there's no reason to keep any information about a transaction. So I think it's really dependent. But again, regulation is a double-edged sword, because you're always going to have circumstances where someone's not going to fit neatly into the regulation. Yeah, totally. And I think this comes back to, remember I talked at the start about resilience and assume breach. Like if you are keeping data, assume at some point that could be basically ransomware or taken, extracted from your system, and understanding then what you're going to do about that and what impact it's going to have, and then building your security around that philosophy. I think that's really important.
There's one quick question from the room, and then we'll have to wrap it up. And this comes back to your hamster of the CISO, the CISO hamster. Does the constant change of CISO prevent stagnation and compliancy? Yeah, I think it's compliancy. Or does it have a negative effect because no one is in the role long enough to master the role?
That's a really good question. So I would say more the latter. I think it hurts, because what happens is at the CISO level, it's about strategy and it's about having a long-term plan. So if every 17 or 18 months the CISO is changing, then the leadership is going to kind of probably degrade. So on the one hand, yes, you'll get lots of good ideas. You'll have lots of probably really energetic people at the start because they keep changing. But on the other hand, if no one's seeing through a strategy, I think in the long term, that's a negative overall. Plus, there's also the relationship that you need the CISO to have with the board and the other executives. So if they're changing regularly, it's hard to build that rapport.
And I guess the follow-up from that is, for all of the budding CISO people in the room, what's the next job rate once you've done the 17 months?
Oh, I think you become a consultant, don't you?
There you go. So there is a life outside the public service then. Look, thank you very much, Dave, and we'll wrap this session up now. So it's been really interesting, and I've actually found it fascinating. So
Thanks
everyone, join me in thanking Dave.
I know it's a bit of a dry topic for a Monday morning, so I apologise for that, but thank you for your attention.
That's good. So we'll have about a 10-minute break. There's some morning tea at the back. Bathrooms are out the front, and we'll fill up the water jugs, and we'll be back shortly on the virtual room. started talking?
Oh,
Green. Okay. Introduce to you our next speaker. This is Andrew Muller, who's the Managing Director of Ionize Proprietary Limited. Again, for the virtual, welcome back. And just make sure that you have limited distractions around you. And again, please feel free to put questions into the chat as we go. So let me introduce to you Andrew. Andrew has been the Managing Director of the Australian-based cybersecurity firm Ionize since 2008. Gosh, it's hard to say 2008 now, isn't it? It's like that's so many years ago. He has been expanding Ionize throughout Australia, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and the Pacific with a range of cybersecurity services, including cyber governance, cyber defense, cyber offensive, and cyber education services. Andrew has worked in the commercial and government sectors, from startups to multinational enterprises. He has also contributed to a range of open source security projects, such as the OWASP testing guide. I hope I've said that right. Good. He has a passion for the cybersecurity industry and benefits it provides to businesses worldwide. He holds a Master's of Science from UNSW and lectures at UNSW on cybersecurity subjects. So join me in welcoming Andrew to the stage. And you've got a treat for it, experiment demonstrations.
Oh, yes, that's working. Excellent. Very good. G'day. So I'm Andrew. Thanks very much for being here and your attention. I think after Dave's presentation, you've got a bit of an indication now of the breadth and depth of the cybersecurity industry. It's huge. It's a monster, and that's kind of what Dave was trying to portray, is that it's there's lots and lots and lots of niches, squillions of them, and what I'll be sort of doing today is just but one tiny little slither within a fairly broad ecosystem. Another thing I'll say about I guess what I'll be doing today is I don't think any of this stuff is rocket science. It always looks amazing and spooky and scary until you actually do it, and then you're disappointed because it's like, oh, it's just boring. Can I stand on the stage? Yeah. Yep. Oh, because I'm not being seen. Okay, very good. Sorry, apologies for those who are virtual. So what I'll be going through is we all stand on the shoulders all stand on the shoulders of giants. There's nothing particularly esoteric about any of this. It's all pretty standard stuff. It's just a matter of, I guess, Googling a bunch of blogs, all that sort of stuff. So it's all very, very accessible sort of information. So none of what I'm going to show you is particularly, in my mind at least, weird and wonderful. So it's just a matter of asking a few people some questions, probing, and then you'll get a good sense of what's going on. One thing I will say is anything that what I'm doing here will definitely void your warranty. You could destroy your device. You could upset the vendor as well. So I've heard a few instances of vendors getting a little bit upset. Sorry. Yeah, it's on. Close to the mouth. That better? Yep, all good. All right. All right. Hopefully we'll find out all the bugs. So it is, yeah, everyone's seems to be all good. Yep, cool. So messing with this sort of stuff, it is fun, but you can basically break stuff. So just be prepared for that. So if it's not your router, NAS, whatever it is that you're having a look at, maybe ask for permission in order to have a bit of a crack at it. Is this working now, Janelle? You see. Oh, it does. So where did I start with all this? So like in this specific domain. So I guess I'm probably not dissimilar from David, been in the industry for probably way too long. In this particular area, in the area of hardware hacking, for me, it all started with spending stacks of money on buying these sorts of things, and then wanting like really granular security features. So spending like a couple $100 on it, and wanting just a little bit more, squeeze a bit more out of the toothpaste tube. And I was always disappointed, always. So I'd buy the latest and greatest, and like, oh, this will be it. This is the one that's going to give me exactly what I need. Never was, never was. It was always some half-baked device that had a pretty rotten web UI, and I was always a little bit disappointed. So I wanted to maximize the utility of my investment in these things. So these devices, as I surmised, had an operating system of some description that I should be able to play with. There should be something going on in there that I can manipulate to get what I want to get out of it. So that there had to be some kind of way, was my thought process. So most recently, I've had a multitude of disappointments. This is just one of many. It's a I guess consumer grade device. It has so they kind of treat us like idiots, I guess, that they give us really, really simple options in the web UI. And it just wasn't enough for me. I wanted something really, really detailed, and I guess the power to kind of do whatever I wanted with the thing. So this is the one I'll be going through. So who here has developed software, even like hacky sort of software scripting? Yeah, so there's been people have had a bit of a play. So in the same way that you've got to debug your software, and the way that people like me tend to do it is like a whole lot of print statements, which is not a great way to do debugging of software. In the same way, software developers have to debug their software, so do hardware developers. So they will build in debug ports into their devices to ensure the device is working correctly at the factory. So before they ship it, they'll basically shove it onto a pad that makes the connections to the right place on the PCB, on the raw PCB, which is inside this box. They'll run some power through it, run some rudimentary tests. It's working. Yep, happy days. Boom, stick it in the box, ship it. So they need a way to be able to do this quickly. So that's basically kind of what we're exploiting in this case. And I guess when I say the word exploit, I'm reminded that what I said before, my initial entree into all of this was not security, had nothing to do with security. All I wanted to do was just squeeze a little bit more functionality out of this thing. That was all I was trying to do. So mainly there's actually more than this, but I've kept this presentation like deliberately tried to keep it relatively simple because it can just explode. Like exactly what Dave's presentation portrayed. Like you walk in through a door and there's a massive room on the other side. So it is with this. So there's usually two interfaces that people tend to play with in this realm. One is JTAG, and the other is UART. The one that we're going to be focusing on today is UART because it's really, really simple, and it gives you a good entree into exploiting some of the web vulnerabilities that you'll find in the UI when you interact with the device. Plus, you can find other bits and bobs in there, which is quite useful. Oops, so online folks can't see anything. Oh, well, you'll have to listen to my voice, lucky you. JTAG. So you'll see like a very strong theme, and this goes through pretty much all of my, I guess, training and presentations is Google. Google is your friend. No one knows everything, not even remotely close. So when you're presented with a problem, what do? Just hit Google. My mantra is somebody has had a crack at this before. Something similar, or usually precisely the same thing. So there's not much point, well, there is some point going through it yourself and struggling and experiencing some of the pain, but hit Google, someone's done it. So you want to see if someone else has already identified the JTAG interface pins on your device. That's step one. Don't go through all the other stuff first, unless you like pain. There's other websites, again, like this would drop out of the Google search. You get your JTAG test.com, which has common pinouts for these sorts of things, for different sorts of JTAG interfaces. But generally on a physical, so if they fail, this is almost like going through steps. If they fail, you look for 10 to 20 dual inline. So that's like basically two rows of pins on the board or pins labeled, quite obviously, JTAG, which happens quite a bit. So when you look at it, and I guess you get used to it, and you've looked at a few boards, it starts to become, you start to, like with anything, you develop these patterns, you start to see patterns emerge, and you'll much more quickly identify, well, that looks kind of like it could be JTAG pins, that looks like it could be UART pins, and you just build up that, I guess, your own knowledge base, if you like. So when it's to actually identify what pins are what, when you actually identify these dual inline pinouts, is tools like JTagulator, use the bus pirate interface board, use it to dump the firmware, and then you can manipulate it and then re-upload it and have a, oh, they can't see the slides. That would kind of make this hard. Yep. Yeah, it's still good. So anyway, so I'm obviously, like I said before, I'm not going to be going into this one. Like there's so much depth and breadth to the domain. I'm just going to focus on one little slice. And now I've got those slides. Janelle? Yep. All right. So the next one, I'll preempt because I know what the next slide is UART. So UART is what we'll be doing. It's much simpler to play with. You don't need like super specialist knowledge about like how to analyze the firmware when you've dumped it. But in this case, you hit Google, of course. That makes an awful lot of sense. There are some websites, and I have in my presenting slides, if we get a chance to see them, some websites that I tend to go to find if someone's already found those pinouts. But in this case, you're looking for 4 pins for UART, and they're inline, so single inline 4 pins that are on the PCB. So they can have header pins on them already, which I'll explain what that's all about, or they may just be a couple, like 4 holes in the PCB, and they might have a label saying serial or UART, or it just might be, oh, they look suspiciously like they could be UART pins, and then you test them out, which is what we'll be going through in the demo. We're gonna, so I'll just proceed through. Bear with me. This is something like what my demo is going to look like, FYI. Like, am I? So, yeah, so many slides, Dave. Jeez. Was there? There. How many slides I like of yours, Dave? Right. Hey, here we are. Oh, whoops. Go back on. Same deal here. Like Google, look at these websites. You could use JTagulator, it costs a lot of money. I wouldn't use it. The way I tend to approach things is basically like minimalist. Why minimalist? Because like I don't want someone dropping $400 on a JTagulator or something when you can get all the bits for like 80 cents from AliExpress. Like that doesn't make any sense to me. And I want it to be accessible and just show people that it's all, that's not mysterious. It's all pretty straightforward. So what would go through is the identifying the ground pin. So I'll be using the multimeter for that guy. And then we wanted to identify the transmission pin, the TX pin. So we can, there's a couple of ways to do this, not least of which is my old friend, trial and error. Because if there's only 4 pins and 4 possibilities with the connections, like you can very rapidly go through it manually. So you can identify the TX pin. The TX pin is basically going to be sending like a what is a like a different voltage levels representing ones and zeros, and we'll see it on the oscope. So as each of those will represent ones and zeros, and it's basically just like blurting out like ASCII characters, if you like, in binary. If anyone's comfortable with that, that's basically what you'll end up seeing. And it'll be really obvious when you see, particularly when you see it on the O-scope, which is why I've brought the O-scope. It's really, really obvious what it is. You see it blurred out and you're like, okay, yeah, that's definitely the TX pin. Trying to identify it with the multimeter, as some or maybe no one knows, but a multimeter is a voltage measurement like in time, like one slice. What the O-scope gives us is the voltage measurement, but over time, so we can see the oscillations much more clearly as opposed to the multimeter. Can you identify the TX pin with the multimeter? Yeah, but man, it would be pretty ugly, and you'd be kind of, you wouldn't be super sure. That's why, again, I brought the O-scope. And the main reason you want the O-scope is to determine the baud rate. So with serial connections, for those who've mucked around with serial connections for many, many years, there's literally only like a handful of common baud rates that you'll see, a handful. So you could use my old friend trial and error to figure it out, but it just makes your life a little bit easier, and it makes you feel a little bit more techie if you're pulling out your O-scope and determining baud rates and all that sort of malarkey. And then we have to guess VCC, not so important, but definitely the receive pin. So the receive pin we'll use to basically, so obviously TX is shoveling data at us. Well, we want to interact, so we want to send to it as well. The reason that we have to guess it is because it's not sending anything. So we just have to fiddle around. Again, my old friend trial and error comes into play. We shuffle the pins around, and then we'll figure it out. Yay. Can you try and go to the next slide? No? All right. So how do you find the interfaces? I've just sort of went through that. Multimeter, O-scope. So there's, again, I'm not a massive fan of spending squillions of bucks on stuff. So this is an entry-level DSO oscilloscope. It's like $400 or thereabouts. I wouldn't recommend buying one unless you've got other things you're going to use it on, because there are really, really cheap options, say on Alibaba, for example. Like there's $30 kind of put it together yourself oscilloscopes. That's much more within reach of most people. Before you start shelling out $400 for this guy, like we're talking, quite a significant difference. But again, I'll just show you like how useful it can be if you're interested in going this. But Google's your friend, 100%. Like so many times, it's just someone's done it all for you before. Aha. All right, so I was talking about some of the websites that will tell you everything about these things. So other people, believe it or not, as I said, had gone through the same pain as me and were like, the firmwares, like the web UI, the functionality of this thing sucks. We're going to write our own. I never could, but somebody, thank goodness, did. So there's these projects out there like DDWRT, which is, you can see, a Linux-based alternative open source firmware suitable for a great variety of wireless routers and blah, 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 blah. Brilliant. So exactly what I was looking for this. So this will provide a whole lot of hardware-related information for this guy. Another project is Advanced Tomato. Why on earth they decided to call it that, I have no idea. There must be some story. I don't really want to know what it is. And then there's OpenWRT. This is the first one I found, the one I feel most comfortable with. So it not only has the actual firmware up there as well, but I search for UART. So if I want to find what sort of devices have UART interfaces on them, basically serial interfaces, I search for that. And then I can find, say, that's not actually this guy, but it's pretty close. I find the device that I'm looking for, and if I scroll down in that guy, I get to serial, and it tells me, oh, there you go, there's the pins that allow me to connect to the serial console. There's the baud rate, blah, 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 blah. And here's a sample of the guff that it'll spew out at you during boot up. So fantastic. Again, Google comes to the rescue and have the base assumption that someone has done it before. And in this case, they absolutely have. So now that I've found it, And we'll go through all of this in the demo, if everything goes well. How do I actually interact with it? So again, in the interest of showing that this is not a complicated or expensive exercise by any means, 80 cents on AliExpress for that little doodad, which is just that piece, which is the TTL to serial converter, and the DuPont cables, which are the little cable doodads there, just make your life easier, for $4.62, jeepers, why wouldn't you? With that, and perhaps some of these things, you're pretty much good to go. And some of these you can even borrow, or if you go to your, I don't know, if you did study in Canberra, go back to your uni and say, hey, have you got an O-scope that I could borrow? Then happy days. You don't have to pay for any of that sort of stuff. And then you just need PuTTY on your computer to interact with it. So PuTTY, most people use it for SSH connections, if you are familiar with PuTTY. If you're not, you're about to be. But there's also options there to interact with the serial interface, and I'll explain a bit about that as we go in, because you have to identify which interface it's on your actual hardware, which is all part of the fun. Oh, jeepers. So I'm a man who likes to play with fire. So demo time. So the reason I like demos is because one of the most important features of going through a demo is failure, of anything is failure. And you get to see how I or anybody deals with failure, which is really, really important. So having a demo that goes perfectly, or a video and it's like, oh, look, it's all wonderful. That's not the real world. In the real world, things go wrong, and that will probably occur in this case. And I want you to see how someone deals with failure, whether they completely wig out, or they just revert to some of those, I guess, lower order ways to find out the correct pins, trial and error, and all that sort of stuff that I mentioned. So, all right, we'll get started. So this is the device I was talking about. Has anyone got I don't know if I brought my screwdriver. There's failure one. Yeah. Otherwise, I'm just going to rip this sucker open. I need a Phillips head. Yeah, this is all part of the game. All right. Just about to refit. Oh, wow. Oh, that may not fit. Wow. ACS screwdriver kit. Get yours wherever you can. Yep, which is not me. I don't need that guy. So thankfully I was mindful enough to take out most of the screws last night, but I had to put one back in because otherwise the whole thing just falls apart. It's bits a bit annoying. All right, 4 bananas. There we go. All it falls apart. Excellent. So we've got a PCB. It's going to be hard for the folks online to see. Whole bunch of stuff on it. One of the practices I tend to go through is identifying so all of these chips on there, they might look weird and mysterious, but they've got silk screen on them names that tells you what they are and what they do. So you can look up the data sheets and find out what they do. But in the what I was talking about before about looking for UART connectors, I'm looking around at this thing. Use this as a pointer. Looking around, and immediately I'm drawn to 4 pins that are soldered on there already. So, my assumption is, that's, and a pretty decent assumption, that's going to be some sort of UART connector. So the way to validate that theory is to basically plug it in. Actually, one of the first things we'll do is, as I said before, look for the ground pin. So I'm going to assume that they have something to do with UART. Again, 4 pins in line. It's a pretty good bet that that's what it's going to be. So I'm going to basically target anywhere, like any sort of metal on the PCB, because that ground pin will be grounded to that. And anything that has like close to 0 reading, which is what that one is, that's 000.3. The next pin along is, whoops, if I can hold my hand steady, is a lot more, like 4 or 5. So it's not going to be that guy. So this is the resistance that it's measuring. That's not telling me anything. Maybe it's just because I can't hold my hand still. That's got a relatively high resistance. So it looks like that first pin is going to be ground, which I also know is actually the fact. So I'm going to go with that one. So the next thing we've got to do, so we've located the ground pin, which is going to be that first pin there. So for those that can actually see this, those online are going to have trouble. It's the one on your left, the leftmost pin there is going to be ground. Next thing we have to do is find the TX pin. So the only way we're going to do that is by applying power to it and then trying the next 3 pins to see what's going on with each of them. So I've got my power here. Stick it in there. So it's not on yet. Then I attach, and I'm going to have to do this all in reverse. This is going to be fun. So I attach my ground lead from my oscilloscope probe to, guess what, ground. So I could either pick the pin, which is what I've done, or stick it onto some other metal on the casing. But I'm putting it on the ground pin just for display purposes. And then I've got my other probe, which I've attached to the next pin along. So we've got our oscilloscope. I'm going to have to put it a little bit sideways so I can actually see what's going on. We turn it on. We can see the voltage has gone up to 3.3 volts, and there kind of ain't much going on. So we should see something pretty much immediately if we've got the right TX pin. So I've turned it off. I'll turn it on again. It's just gone up. Nothing's, yeah, just, nope, just sitting there at 3. Oh, nope, we saw some stuff there. Those that are here can see that there's, because you have to be quite close, so no one at the back's going to be able to see this, but take my word for it. There's some changes, like we can see basically, well, if I had a whiteboard I could do this, but we can see the voltage go up in a square wave and it drops down, another square wave, and it very much looks like there's some data that's being transferred there. Which is fantastic. So the next thing we would do, it's going to be really difficult to do in like reverse with me doing it from behind, but we basically will measure the smallest pulse width. So what I'm assuming there, if I can find what I think is the shortest pulse width, is that from that I can determine, like, so for the time that it takes for that pulse to occur, I can then obviously determine what the baud rate is. Which is what I will need to do. So again, one of the useful features of having an oscope versus just trying to do it sort of old school and guessing and so on. So at that point, we should have our, and if it was a smaller group or I had I guess prepared slightly better with AV to focus in on what was going on with the oscope, I guess take my word for it, that would determine what the baud rate is. And now we're in we've determined what the TX pin is, which is that third one along. Again, whiteboard would be useful. So now I go through the process of basically connecting my TTL to a USB connector. So each of the pins on this guy will relate on the back there. It's silk screened onto the PCB that, you know, whether it's a TX or an RX or a ground pin. So basically I've got to align those with the pins on the board, and if all goes well, which it probably won't because it's a demo, then we'll start to see when I get my computer, we'll start to see some of the that boot up information spew out from the router, and we'll get a bit of an idea of what's going on. So to that, Vicky, could you pass my? Thank you very much. Got any questions? What in these interludes? Please fire them off. Unless the question is why are you doing this? All right. So I've got my. So I will disconnect this. TX ground. So in some cases, or actually quite a few cases, these header pins that I'm just connecting this device to now, they won't be there. So there's plenty of cases like I've had a look at a multitude of these routers and NASs and you name it. The pins aren't there, so you have to rely on your, in my case, fairly dodgy soldering skills to solder something onto the board in order to connect something to it. All right, so I've just turned that off. The next.
Andrew, while you're doing that, someone's just asked, where do you get the serial to USB connector?
Oh, that was in the one of the previous slides. So yeah, Alibaba, go to JCar might have them, but they'll cost a lot more. If you're willing to wait for it, hit Alibaba. So log on to this guy first. All right. So what I've got here open, I've got the device manager open. Be a different story if you're using Linux, but this is Windows, and I've got the other window there is PuTTY. So I'm connecting it to the computer, and one thing I will need to check in order to use PuTTY correctly is to see what the what COM port is being used. Otherwise, it's going to be, like, again, a lot more trial and error. I can see COM3 if I can read upside down correctly. Yep, I've what do we want? 200. So the baud rate in this case is 15,200. Sorry, 115,200, 115,200. Very common serial baud rate. There's like I said, there's literally only about 6 that are commonly used, this being one of them. All right, so I've got that connected. This is incredibly difficult to do upside down. What's going on? I'm just going to pop down here so I can actually see what on earth is going on. So I've got my PuTTY console open. So if everything's gone well, when I turn this on, it should spew out a bunch of stuff. And it has. Oh my goodness. So there you go. I'm a bit surprised it actually worked first time. So what it's doing is going through the boot up process, and it's basically giving us a bunch of information. What it will end on. A lot of these, pointing at the wrong thing. A lot of these routers and NASs, they use something called BusyBox. Really common. I guess shell, if you like, to be able to interact with the router. So once it's finished the boot up process, it'll basically give you a root shell, like basically system level access if you're Windows, root in the Unix world. So you've got basically full access to the operating system of the router, and you can start to do whatever you like to it. So at that point, I guess things that like a security person like Dave and myself would be looking for is to go through and start looking okay, what sort of binaries are on there, a bit of exploration of the host, understanding where the, say, the web scripts are kept. So when you're interacting with the web UI, you want to know if you can do anything that you shouldn't be able to do in there, that sort of stuff. As the thing that I was looking for, back to my initial proposition, the thing I was looking for is things like IP tables, stuff like that, stuff that I can fiddle with to make it do stuff that it was not actually designed to do. So in this case, you know, I've gone through and installed OpenWIT on the device, but this is actually a really common way for people to get access to the router, access all of the web source code, so that they can go through, find vulnerabilities, and then basically register CVEs and all the rest of it. So that's kind of why this is an important, I guess, process to go through. Very good. We might go back to the slides at this point. Can we? Is there any questions on any of that? I know I've sort of gone through and potentially introduced something that's no one's ever thought of before. Yeah. So that, I mean, that's what I guess me and my team, that's what we do with it, is that we're looking for vulnerabilities in the, I guess, the web source code, for example. You know, looking for, you know, stuff in the network stack, which is what you'd probably have to dump the firmware for to be able to determine. But looking for problems in it. So I guess that's where my journey sort of switched. Initially, I'd started off going, this thing's rubbish and I need to make it actually do some useful stuff, to actually I can find out what's going on and, you know, maybe register some CVEs related to some of the flaws in this, or more importantly, tell Netgear about them and hopefully they can fix them. No, absolutely. I mean, these are commodity objects, so they couldn't care less about them, to be honest. It's just like the nature of it, and it makes total sense to me that they wouldn't. So it's just a good, I guess, proving ground for vulnerability researchers. If you're particularly interested in it, it's just a good way to get into it, if you like. Yep. Yep. So I mean, I find it fascinating. Other people might think it's a bit, you know, a bit weird and dull, but each their own. So where we find these sorts of things, so obviously routers is an obvious one. Just turn that off now so no one gets fried. You find them in routers, modems. This is both. You find them in switches, cameras, NASs, TVs, toys, you name it. All sorts of stuff. And I guess when I've gone through this process, I've only just focused on UART. So another way to go is, well, JTAG is what I mentioned. But even if you found, say, and there is a flash chip on this device, if you had something that didn't have UART connectors, had no JTAG connectors, but you could find the flash on the device, you could basically reflash the device by interacting directly with the chip, which is a little bit more, I guess, potentially dangerous. But there's a multitude of ways to play with these things and find out what's going on. So one project that me and one of our guys is working on at the moment, completely not security related, is a little gaming device. It's got some gaming ROMs stored on a flash memory, and we're going to dump the flash and rewrite it so we can play different games on it. Silly little things like that, but it's just interacting with hardware, making it. This is what the true sense of the word hacker actually means, is making stuff do that which it was not actually intended to do. So you can find it in a whole bunch of things, and we have found them on, like, you name it, all sorts of stuff. And I guess in the security realm, you are looking more for okay, how can I exploit this, and then tell the vendor, make sure they fix it, so on and so forth. All right, so this is the big one. So this is the so what, and kind of what I was referring to before. It's like, so what does this mean? Like, who cares, basically? So when I go home and I talk to my daughter about what I did with my day, she gives me that look of like, who cares? So I need to explain this as well. So there's a couple of CVEs that relate to protections on, lack of protection on the UART console. Me personally, I would never raise these as CVEs because like I don't know, it's just one of those things that's just there and you have to have physical access. So, I mean, geez, like that's a tough call to register that as a CVE. But look, if people are going to start doing it, happy days. And like, here's a new one then. Like, so I've found these sorts of things on tons of devices, haven't reported one of them because don't really think it's a massive thing. But obviously people are starting to get into it, but it is a good way to figure out what's going on the device and basically do a source code audit of all the web UI and the networky scripts that are going on when it starts up to see what you can do to break it. So this is usually the entry point into like worse vulnerabilities. And when you're talking about like a basically a modem router, it's basically your network. Like if you could turn that into like basically a span port or something like that, where it's just basically copying all your traffic, or if it's your VPN endpoint and you're just copying some plain text on somewhere else for somebody else. Like there's a squillion different scenarios. Another one is a NAS, for example. What do you have on NAS? Bucket loads of data. So what if someone was siphoning that off because they figured out some vulnerability through basically hardware hacking, very similar to what we've done here today. So there's a bunch of applications. It is sort of, I guess the whole intent of this presentation is just sort of open the door a crack so you can see that there's some stuff in that room. Not open it too much because it turns into like a tangled mess of stuff that will take a heck of a lot of Googling to figure out. But just to get you sort of started and thinking down that road, I think. Hey, Q&A. So, question.
Well, if everyone would like to join me in thanking Andrew, a demonstration is always a good thing. Oops, sorry, I'm right in the front of the camera. Thank you so much for that, Andrew. It's quite scary for someone who's not an IT person. So hopefully you're going to save the world. First question.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andrew. That was a really interesting demo to see sort of just how, well, straightforward is probably the wrong word, but just how directly you can interact with a lot of these consumer devices. On that, when you're going about this and when you do discover vulnerabilities with these devices, like, I mean, actual potential security vulnerabilities outside of just, hey, look, we've got hardware access. You were saying that, there's a process you go through, you create a CVE for it, you talk with the vendor, hopefully they actually collaborate. What actually is the success rate of vendors being interested in security vulnerabilities rather than either putting up a wall or threatening you with legal action?
It's pretty mixed, to be honest. So it's not so much legal action anymore. That used to happen quite a lot, but doesn't really happen anymore. I guess so I have a very particular view. Like there's literally holy wars fought over responsible disclosure. Should you just release it on the Twitters and not help the vendors, or should you go the other way and support the vendors? So my view is releasing on the Twitters is not a cool move because you do expose a lot of people by doing that. Talking to the vendor to the greatest extent possible. Will they respond to you? I've reported stacks of things where they've not responded. My play is to go, well, you've got things on. And there's ones where they have responded, but the patch isn't coming for another 6 months. And it's been like 6 months before that we actually told them. Is it fair to put them under pressure and say, oh, we're going to just release it in 4 weeks? And, that doesn't seem right to me either, because like if you think the people who say we should just dump it on the Twitters, it's usually not their stuff. When it's your stuff, it matters very differently. So let's say there was a way to, tell the internet whether you're home or not. And would you be like, oh yeah, sure, tell everyone? It's like, no, you wouldn't. You'd be like a little bit more guarded about it. So it's just being considerate and thinking, much like what we're doing with, I guess, pen testing and hacking, is thinking about, okay, what's going on behind the scenes? Why is that company delaying? Maybe they don't have the processes in place. Maybe they've got a whole lot of other stuff on their plate at the moment, which means they just can't get to it. So I tend to be more that guy than the.
And I guess that comes back to when Dave was talking about the implications of what your actions are as well. How's it going to harm other people
Yeah.
in terms of that conversation
Yeah,
too.
yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering what your experience with like installing backdoors or viewing cameras, I guess, remotely, stuff like that, and if you have been able to do that, if that's changed your perspective on devices and things in general.
100%. Yeah. Look, I think it's this is sort of a raging debate at the moment about whether vendors should be responsible, held responsible if vulnerabilities are found and they cause, damage to people's lives. It definitely concerns me a bit. There's only so much you can do though. There's always going to be some sort of issue. We've done all sorts of, weird and wonderful things, including tracking people from telcos in other countries and all sorts of stuff by hacking in through their networks. But there's only so much you can do. So yeah, look, it does open your eyes, but it's not going to turn me into someone who's super paranoid. To I guess Dave's point before about information like being leaked on the dark web, there's like literally billions of records out there. Your stuff is definitely out there. So I've just made my peace with it. It's like, oh well, that's just the way it is.
I was just going to ask, its security aspect with hardware, it's quite limited of how to protect access to the hardware, I guess. But do you reckon it got left behind with the whole security uplift going around and with the emerging things like Bluetooth trackers? Do you reckon there's works to make it better? Or
So in this, you mean in detecting access
yeah, so
at a physical level?
yeah,
I guess it's kind of like Dave described it before, like the law of the jungle. Like it just takes a few people to get eaten, and then either people go, oh my gosh, I'll run faster, or they're like, oh stop, we're going to actually legislate something. So I guess the more, if you like, for the to continue the analogy, people get eaten by this sort of thing, then something may be done. But until that point, it won't be. There's certainly more burning issues than I guess people connecting to UART interfaces on hardware. But look, it could totally become a thing. There's like say TPM chips, for example, like became a massive thing. People detecting changes to hardware on PCs, but it hasn't really bled into other tech as yet. It may change.
One more in the room and then go to the virtual room.
I was actually scratching my nose, but I'll take the opportunity. I'm not an IT geek, so I might be completely off the subject here. But I just wonder, do you anticipate this becoming potentially of more importance with the rise of the Internet of Things and so on? It's much spoken of the interconnectivity between everything from refrigerators to cars, that these kind of vulnerabilities will become more important in that respect.
Yeah, look, I would say so. Yeah, like there's so many devices out there. I mean, I listed off some. There's things out there you wouldn't even dream of, like Bluetooth enabled temperature control, asset management stuff, you name it, all sorts of weird and wonderful stuff, which we've been lucky enough to have a bit of a crack at. Is it going to, like, there's definitely a focus on it. But again, I think it comes back to that law of the jungle. Like after a few people get eaten, people go, oh, maybe we should do something about this. Until then, I don't think it's going to drive, much change in that regard. Yeah, look, I think it's, I do subscribe to that law of the jungle, and I think it's entirely appropriate to perhaps not focus on it. All of us got limited resources, limited time, limited money. You can't focus on everything. So just focus on the place, if there's a particular watering hole where stacks of people are getting eaten, do something about that, rather than one that, maybe 3 weeks down the line, someone might get eaten. That's all you can do.
Okay, the question I was going to ask on the virtual room has disappeared. So one last question, lucky you.
I was just going to ask, I'm not sure if you know about the recent DFAT cameras and the whole exposure there. Yeah. How big of an incident is that actually, as far as like Australia can't really procure cameras that are developed in Australia? They're going to be Chinese regardless. So Like, if we're sort of limited for options, what can we really do to mitigate that risk?
For cameras.
Just
That's
don't
a-
have cameras.
It's good. I mean, where was this manufactured? It's like China is the manufacturing hub of the world. It's just is what it is. I don't know. Like, there's lots, I don't want to be controversial, but I don't think, I think I don't think the Chinese are looking at absolutely everything, for example. Like, so are they going to be really interested in what's going on with someone's home router? I don't think so. Like, if they saw my browsing habits, they'd be bitterly disappointed. So, like, there's only so much you can do. Like, but that would potentially would have been informed by some sort of intelligence as to that something was going on with that. It could just be paranoia.
Well, I heard that it was in the user agreement that all the camera footage gets sent back to China.
Okay, the
Yeah.
cameras get sent back. Okay.
The footage, yeah, in the user agreement. So I guess just an oversight.
Yeah. So I mean, look, that would be so. Like, there's all sorts of stuff in contracts and user agreements that doesn't actually happen. So it could have been just in there because they, like, I would imagine, like any company, they want to be helpful. They want adoption of their technology. They want it to work so people buy more. Yeah, it just depends on your point of view. Like, I mean, yeah, it's a tangled web, and I'm not going to say anything too controversial, so I'll just leave it there.
Okay, so Andrew, thank you so much. Thank you for everyone's questions, and please everyone join me in thanking Andrew and Dave for their great presentations. Okay, final couple of slides before you can get to lunch.